Stereotypic beliefs about women's roles, for example, may enable one to see correctly that a woman in a dark room is threading a needle rather than tying a fishing lure, but they may also cause one to mistakenly assume that her goal is embroidery rather than cardiac surgery. Dan Gilbert. Expectations and biased information processing. To stereotype is to overgeneralize, but of course, people don't generalize everything they witness to the same degree. Some acts, an epileptic seizure for example, discourage generalization from the individual to the group, no matter who the actor is. Other behaviors, such as rudeness, invite it. In general, people are more likely to generalize behaviors and traits they already suspect may be typical of the group's members. This is another way in which stereotypes can be self-reinforcing. Actions that are consistent with an existing stereotype are noticed, deemed significant, and remembered, whereas actions that are at variance with the stereotype may be ignored, dismissed, or quickly forgotten. Stereotypes also influence how the details of events are interpreted. In a striking demonstration of this effect, white participants watched a videotape of a heated discussion between two men, one black and one white, and were asked to code the behavior they were watching into one of several categories, such as gives information, playing around, or aggressive behavior. 1976. At one point in the video, one of the men shoved the other. For half the participants, a black man shoved the white man. For the other half, the white man did the shoving. The race of the person made a difference in how the action was interpreted. When perpetrated by a white man, the incident tended to be coded as more benign, as playing around, for example. When perpetrated by a black man, it was coded as a more serious action, such as aggressive behavior. These results are remarkable because the participants saw the shove with their own eyes. The influence of stereotypes can be even greater when the episode is presented to people secondhand and is therefore more open to being construed in different ways. In one study, for instance, participants listened to a play-by-play account of a college basketball game and were told to focus on the exploits of one player in particular, named Mark Flick. 1997. Half the participants saw a photo of Mark that made it clear he was African American, and half saw a photo that made it clear he was white. When participants rated Mark's performance, their assessments reflected commonly held stereotypes about black and white basketball players. Those who thought Mark was African American rated him as more athletic and as having played better. Those who thought he was white rated him as having hustled more and as having played a more savvy game. Studies like these demonstrate that people don't evaluate information even-handedly. Instead, information that's consistent with a group stereotype typically has more impact than information that's inconsistent with it. This is yet another way that even inaccurate stereotypes can stay alive and even grow in strength. Self-fulfilling prophecies. Stereotypes can also be reinforced by self-fulfilling prophecies. That is, people act toward members of certain groups in ways that encourage the very behavior they expect to see from those groups. For example, thinking that members of a particular group are hostile, a person might act toward them in a guarded manner, thereby eliciting a coldness that's then taken as proof of their hostility. A teacher who believes members of a specific group lack intellectual ability may give them less attention in class, thereby increasing the chances that they'll fall behind their classmates. As Robert Merton, who coined the term self-fulfilling prophecy, once said, "The specious validity of the self-fulfilling prophecy perpetuates a reign of error, for the prophet will cite the actual course of events as proof that he was right from the very beginning." 1957. Oppression has no logic, just a self-fulfilling prophecy, justified by a self-perpetuating system. Gloria Steinem. The damage that can be done by self-fulfilling prophecies was powerfully illustrated in an experiment in which white undergraduates interviewed both black and white men, pretending to be job applicants. 1974. The interviews were monitored, and the researchers discovered that the students, the white interviewers, unwittingly treated black and white applicants differently. When the applicant was black, the interviewer tended to sit farther away, to hem and haw throughout the session, and to terminate the proceedings earlier than when the applicant was white. This is not the type of environment that inspires smooth interview performance. Sure enough, the second phase of the experiment showed just how difficult it had been for the black applicants. Interviewers were trained to treat a new set of applicants, all of whom were white, the way that either the white or the black applicants had been treated earlier. These interviews were tape-recorded and later rated by independent judges. These new applicants, who had been interviewed in the way the black applicants had been interviewed earlier, were evaluated more negatively than those who'd been interviewed in the way the white applicants had been interviewed earlier. In other words, by placing black applicants at a disadvantage by treating them differently, the white interviewers confirmed their negative stereotypes of blacks. Similar results have been obtained in interview studies of gay and lesbian job applicants, 2002. Explaining away exceptions. If every rule has an exception, the same is true for stereotypes. Groups known for their intellectual talents nonetheless include a few dolts. Groups renowned for their athletic abilities are sure to include a klutz or two. Even if a stereotype is largely accurate, there's almost certain to be examples that contradict it. Of course, if the stereotype is completely invalid, counterexamples will be even more plentiful. What happens when people discover evidence that disagrees with their view? Do they abandon their stereotypes or hold them less confidently? The way people respond to disconfirmation of their stereotypes varies according to their emotional investment in the stereotype, whether the stereotype is specific to the person who holds it or is widely shared, and numerous other factors. One thing is clear, however, people don't give up their stereotypes easily. As numerous studies have demonstrated, people evaluate disconfirming evidence in a variety of ways that have the effect of reducing its impact. An understanding of these processes provides some insight into one of the most vexing questions about stereotypes, namely, why they so often persist in the face of evidence that would seem to contradict them. Although we generalize when we stereotype, no one expects perfectly consistent behavior from members of a given group. Groups thought to be dishonest, lazy, or carefree are thought to be dishonest, lazy, or carefree on average, or at least more dishonest, lazy, or carefree than other groups. Not all members are expected to behave in those ways all the time. This loophole lets people remain unmoved by apparent disconfirmations of their stereotypes, because anyone who acts at variance with the stereotype is simply walled off into a category of exceptions. Psychologists refer to this tendency as subtyping. Sexists who believe that women are passive and dependent and should stay home and raise children are likely to subtype assertive, independent women who choose not to have children as militant or strident feminists, thereby leaving their stereotype of women largely intact. Similarly, racists who maintain that African Americans can't excel outside of sports and entertainment are likely to remain untroubled by the likes of, say, Barack Obama, he's half white, or U.S. Senator Kamala Harris, her father was born in Jamaica and her mother in India. To the racist mind, they're merely the exceptions that prove the rule. Incidentally, if you've ever wondered how an exception can prove a rule, it can't. The expression uses the word prove in its less common meaning, to test as in proving grounds. Subtyping. Explaining away exceptions to a given stereotype by creating a subcategory of the stereotyped group that can be expected to differ from the group as a whole. Subtyping reflects a more general truth. People treat evidence that supports a stereotype differently from evidence that refutes it. People tend to accept supportive evidence at face value, whereas they often critically analyze and discount contradictory evidence. One way they do this, in keeping with the self-serving attributional bias, see Chapter 5, is by attributing behavior consistent with a stereotype to the dispositions of the people involved, and attributing behavior inconsistent with a stereotype to external causes. An anti-Semite who believes that Jews are cheap is likely to dismiss a Jewish person's acts of philanthropy as reflecting a desire for social acceptance, but to interpret any pursuit of self-interest as being a reflection of some true Jewish character. Thus, episodes consistent with a stereotype reinforce its perceived validity. Episodes that are inconsistent with the stereotype are deemed insignificant. We also treat supportive and contradictory information differently by varying how concretely or abstractly we evaluate the actions of people from different groups. Almost any action can be construed at different levels of abstraction. See chapters 3, 5, and 8. For example, if you see a person lifting someone who has fallen, you could describe the action concretely as exactly that, as lifting. Alternatively, you could say more abstractly that the person was helping the fallen individual. More abstractly still, you might say the person was being helpful or altruistic. These different levels of abstraction carry different connotations. The more concrete the description, lifting, the less it says about the person involved. The more abstract the description, altruistic, the more it says about the person. These differences in concrete versus abstract construal were examined in a study that took place during the annual Paleo competition in Ferrara, Italy, 1989. The Paleo are horse racing competitions that have taken place in various Italian towns since the 13th century, since the 1200s, with a brief interruption during the time of the Black Plague. Pitting teams from different districts, or contrade, against one another, the races take place in the context of an elaborate festival in which residents of each contrada root for their team. In the weeks leading up to the Paleo, feelings of intergroup competition run high. Before one such Paleo competition, the researchers showed the residents of two contrade, San Giorgio and San Giacomo, a number of sketches depicting a member of their own team or of the rival team engaged in an action. The contrada membership of the person depicted was established simply by having the color of the protagonist's shirt match that of one contrada or another. Some of the sketches portrayed desirable actions, such as helping someone, and some portrayed undesirable actions, such as littering. After inspecting each sketch, the participants described what it depicted, and their responses were scored for level of abstraction. The results revealed a clear bias, figure 11.7. Participants maintained positive views of their own group by describing negative actions of members of their own group on a more concrete level, a low level of abstraction, so the individual was less implicated in the action. The guy from my contrada dropped a piece of paper, but participants maintained their less favorable views of the other group by describing negative actions of members of the other group at a high level of abstraction. The guy from your contrada is a litterer. They did precisely the opposite for positive actions. The guy from my contrada is very kind. The guy from your contrada lifted the little kid on his shoulders. This asymmetry feeds the tendency to perceive the in-group in a favorable light. Abstractly evaluating events that fit one's stereotypes lends them greater import. Concretely evaluating events that violate one's preferences or expectations renders them less consequential. It's basically softening language. Figure 11.7, Stereotypes and the Encoding of Behavior. People encode events consistent with their pre-existing stereotypes, both positive events associated with the in-group and negative events associated with the out-group, at a more abstract and therefore more meaningful level than events that are inconsistent with pre-existing stereotypes. This graph shows the percentage of abstract versus concrete terms used to describe desirable and undesirable actions by members of the in-group and out-group. Abstract terms consist of state verbs or trait terms, hates, hateful, loves, loving, and concrete terms consist of descriptive and interpretive action verbs, hits, hurts, lifts, aids. Okay, so this is a side-by-side bar graph with two sets of bars. On the x-axis is desirable events, and the other category of undesirable events. On the y-axis is the percentage of description in abstract terms from 0 to 70%. And the two sets of bars are our own contrada member or rival contrada member. So you can see that abstract terms are used more to describe stereotype-consistent actions, desirable actions by in-group members, undesirable actions by out-group members. So when you look at the category of desirable events, when it's your own contrada member, you're more likely to use abstract terms about 60% of the time. And when the opposite contrada member does something desirable, you only use abstract terms about 45% of the time. And when you look at undesirable events, If it's a member of your own contrada, you describe their behavior in abstract terms only 45% of the time, whereas if it's a rival contrada member who does something undesirable, you'll explain it in abstract terms about 60% of the time, because you want to really emphasize that an opposite contrada member has done something undesirable, and you want to soften the fact that your contrada member has done something undesirable by making it more concrete and thus stripped of its significations. Concrete and abstract construals during the paleo competition. Fans of the paleo competition in Ferrara, Italy, tended to see positive actions by members of their team in abstract, meaningful terms, and negative actions in concrete, less meaningful terms. They did just the opposite for the positive and negative actions of members of the opposing team, making it easier for them to continue to think more positively of their own team and more negatively of the opponents. Explaining away exceptions. People who hold stereotypes of ethnic groups sometimes dismiss examples of individuals who don't conform to the stereotype as exceptions or members of relatively rare subtypes. So you can see in the picture Barack Obama with his wife Michelle Obama standing with Oprah in front of a crowd waving. Accentuation of in-group similarity and out-group difference. There's an apocryphal story about a man who owned a farm near the Russian-Polish border. Over the course of European history, the farm had gone back and forth under the rule of each country many times. After the most recent boundary was drawn, the farmer was uncertain whether he lived in Poland or Russia. To settle the issue, the farmer saved up to have a proper survey conducted and his national identity established. When the survey was finished, the farmer, scarcely able to contain his anticipation, asked, "Well, do I live in Russia or Poland?" The surveyor replied that although remarkably near the border, the entire farm was located in Poland. "Good," the farmer stated. "I don't think I could take those harsh Russian winters." The point of the story, of course, is that although an arbitrary national border can't affect the weather at a fixed location, arbitrary categorical boundaries can have significant effects on the way we perceive things. Indeed, research has shown that merely dividing a continuous distribution into two groups leads people to see less variability within each group and more variability between the two groups. In one study, participants were divided into two arbitrary groups. They then filled out an attitude questionnaire twice, once to record their own attitudes, and once to record how they thought another in-group member or out-group member might respond. Participants consistently assumed that their beliefs were more similar to those of another in-group member than to those of an out-group member, even though the basis of group membership was arbitrary. The remarkable thing about this result is not that people assume more similarity between members within a group than across groups. That makes sense. After all, why categorize members into groups in the first place if the members of each group are not, on average, more similar to one another than they are to the members of the other group? What is remarkable and potentially troubling is that people make such assumptions even when the groups are formed arbitrarily or on the basis of a dimension, such as skin color, age, or body weight, that has no bearing on the attitude or behavior under consideration. In these circumstances, the pure act of categorization distorts judgment. Also, the more people think of outgroup members as homogeneous, the more likely they are to spout prejudices about them and discriminate against them. The outgroup homogeneity effect. Think of a group to which you do not belong: Islamic fundamentalists, reality TV participants, heroin addicts, Tesla owners. It's tempting to think of such groups as a unitary they. We tend to call to mind an image of such groups in which all members think alike, act alike, even look alike. We also tend to assume that the members of an outgroup are more similar to one another than those of us in our in-group are. They all think, act, and look alike. We, on the other hand, are a remarkably varied lot. This tendency is called the outgroup homogeneity effect. The effect can be seen in different perspectives on Latin America. Anglo-Americans often lump all Latinos together, regardless of whether they're from Mexico, Nicaragua, Puerto Rico, or Chile. Meanwhile, Chileans, Puerto Ricans, Nicaraguans, and Mexicans see a great many important differences between the residents of their countries. Outgroup homogeneity effect. The tendency for people to assume that within group similarity is much stronger for outgroups than for in-groups. One study examined the outgroup homogeneity effect by showing Princeton and Rutgers students a series of videos of other students making decisions, such as whether to listen to rock or classical music, or whether to wait alone or with other participants during a break in an experiment, 1980. Half the participants were told the students on the video were from Princeton. Half were told they were from Rutgers. Afterward, the participants estimated the percentage of students at the same university who would make the same choices as those they had seen on the video. The results indicated that the participants assumed more similarity among out-group members than among in-group members. Princeton students who thought they had witnessed a behavior of a Rutgers student were willing to generalize that behavior to other Rutgers students. In contrast, Princeton students who thought they had witnessed the behavior of a Princeton student were less willing to generalize. The opposite was true for Rutgers students. People see more variability of habit and opinion among members of the in-group than they do among members of the out-group. It's easy to understand why the out-group homogeneity effect occurs. For one thing, we typically have much more contact with members of our own in-group than with out-group members, so we have more opportunity to encounter evidence of divergent opinions and habits among in-group members. Indeed, sometimes all we know about an out-group is what its stereotypical characteristics are reputed to be. But having more interactions with the in-group is only half the story. The nature of the interactions we have with in-group and out-group members is likely to be different as well. Because we share the same group membership, we don't treat an in-group member as a representative of a group. It's the person's individual likes, dislikes, talents, and shortcomings that are front and center. Not so with out-group members. We often treat an out-group member merely as a representative of a group, so the person's unique characteristics recede into the background. If we think members of that group are all alike, we're more inclined to behave toward all of them in the same way, thereby eliciting the same kind of behavior from all of them. The expression, "they all look alike," finds support in research that examines people's ability to distinguish faces of members of their own and other races. White people are better at recognizing white faces, Black people are better at recognizing black faces, Hispanics are better at recognizing Hispanic faces, and both the young and the old are better at recognizing faces from their own age group. This own race identification bias appears to result from the fact that people interact with members of their own race as individuals without thinking about race, and so the individual features of the person in question are processed more deeply. When interacting with someone from another race, part of one's attention is drawn to the person's race, taking away from the processing of the person's individuating characteristics. 2007. Own race identification bias. The tendency for people to be better able to recognize and distinguish faces from their own race than from other races. Automatic and controlled processing. Some of the cognitive processes that give rise to stereotyping and prejudice are deliberate, mindful, and conscious, in other words, controlled. Subtyping, "he doesn't count because," is often a conscious process. Other cognitive processes, however, give rise to stereotyping and prejudice rapidly and automatically, without much conscious attention and elaboration. This is particularly likely to be the case for distinctiveness-based illusory correlations and the outgroup homogeneity effect discussed earlier. In the past 30 years, researchers have explored the interplay of automatic and controlled processes, see Chapter 4, and how they collectively influence the way people react to members of different groups. This research has shown that our reactions to different groups of people are, to a surprising degree, guided by quick and automatic mental processes that we can override but not eliminate. The findings also highlight the common discrepancy between our immediate, reflexive reactions to outgroup members and our more reflective responses. Patricia Devine, 1989, examined the joint operation of these automatic and controlled processes by investigating the schism that exists for many people between their knowledge of racial stereotypes and their own beliefs and attitudes toward these same groups. More specifically, Devine sought to demonstrate that what separates prejudiced and non-prejudiced people is not their knowledge of derogatory stereotypes, but whether they resist those stereotypes. To carry out her investigation, Devine relied on the distinction between controlled processes, which we direct more consciously, and automatic processes, which we do not consciously control. The activation of stereotypes is typically an automatic process. Thus, stereotypes can be triggered even if we don't want them to be. Even a non-prejudiced person will, under the right circumstances, access an association between, say, Muslims and fanaticism, blacks and criminality, and WASPs and emotional repression, because those associations are present in our culture. Whereas a bigot will endorse or employ such stereotypes, a non-prejudiced person will employ more controlled cognitive processes to discard or suppress them, or at least try to. To test these ideas, define selected groups of high and low prejudiced participants on the basis of their scores on the modern racism scale. 1989. To show that these two groups don't differ in their automatic processing of stereotypical information, that is, that the same stereotypes are triggered in both high prejudiced and low prejudiced people, she presented each participant with a set of words, one at a time, so briefly that the words could not be consciously identified. Some of them saw neutral words, number, plant, remember, and others saw words stereotypically associated with blacks, welfare, jazz, busing. Devine hypothesized that although the stereotypical words were presented too briefly to be consciously recognized, they would nonetheless prime the participants' stereotypes of blacks. To test this hypothesis, she presented the participants with a written description of an individual who acted in an ambiguously hostile manner, a feature of the African American stereotype. In one incident, for example, the person refused to pay his rent until his apartment was repaired. Was he being needlessly belligerent or appropriately assertive? The results indicated that he was seen as more hostile and more negative overall by participants who had earlier been primed by words designed to activate stereotypes of blacks, words such as jazz, it's important to note, that are not otherwise connected to the concept of hostility. Most importantly, this result was found equally for prejudiced and non-prejudiced participants. Because the words activated their stereotypes unconsciously, the non-prejudiced participants were unable to suppress the automatic processing of stereotypical information. To demonstrate that prejudiced and non-prejudiced people differ primarily in their controlled cognitive processes, if not in their automatic cognitive processes, Devine next asked her participants to list characteristics of Black Americans. As predicted, the prejudiced participants listed many more negative characteristics stereotypically associated with blacks than did non-prejudiced participants. Thus, even though both prejudiced and non-prejudiced people may know the same stereotypes of Black Americans, as shown in the first part of Devine's study, those who are prejudiced believe them and are sometimes willing to voice those beliefs, whereas those who are not prejudiced reject them. Shared stereotypes. Nearly everyone, prejudiced or not, shares common stereotypes that they may or may not try to suppress. In these photos, you may have associated the basketball with the black man, the computer with the Asian student, and the explosion with the Muslim, even though they weren't aligned in this presentation. So you can see the Muslim is next to the computer screen, the black man is next to an explosion, and the Asian student is next to the basketball. Other studies of people's automatic reactions to members of stigmatized groups are quite disturbing. In a study by Keith Payne, 2001, participants had to decide as quickly as possible whether an object depicted in a photo was a handgun or a hand tool, such as pliers. Each photograph was immediately preceded by a picture of either an African American face or a white face. The participants, all of whom were white, were faster to identify a weapon as a weapon when it was preceded by an African American face, and faster to identify a hand tool as a hand tool when it was preceded by a white face. Figure 11.8, see page 394. Do these results mean that the white participants exhibited automatic prejudice toward African Americans? In other words, was the recognition of handguns facilitated by African American faces because the white participants have negative attitudes about both handguns and African Americans? Or are these results due to automatic stereotyping? In other words, is the facilitation caused by a stereotypical association between handguns and African Americans that is activated even in people who don't actually hold prejudiced attitudes toward African Americans? The good news, Limited perhaps, but good news nonetheless, is that it appears to be the latter. Charles Judd, Irene Blair, and Christine Chapleau, 2004, replicated Payne's experiment with 4 types of stimuli that varied in whether they were viewed positively or negatively, and whether they were stereotypically associated with African Americans. Specifically, the stimuli associated with African Americans consisted of pictures of handguns, negative, and sports equipment, positive, and the stimuli not associated with African Americans consisted of pictures of insects, negative, and fruit, positive. Judd and his colleagues found that African American faces facilitated the recognition of both positive and negative stereotypical items, handguns and sports equipment, but not the non-stereotypical items, insects and fruits, regardless of whether they were positive or negative. Figure 11.8, Stereotypes and Categorization. In this study, culturally shared stereotypes of African Americans led white participants to identify handguns more quickly if they had been primed by an African American face, and hand tools more quickly if they had been primed by a white face. So the priming photograph is either a close-up of a white man's face or a black man's face, and the object to be identified as quickly as possible is either a handgun or a pair of pliers.